Miss Marple and the Milkman Who Knew Too Much. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey. As we settle in, tell me, does winter's coziness make you smile, or do you long for bright summer days? Share your thoughts, and please subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Bottles at Dawn. The village of St. Mary Mead lay wrapped in the peculiar silence that comes just before dawn in late winter, when frost has silvered every doorstep and the world seems to hold its breath. It was that hour when honest folk are still abed, and only the industrious and the sly abroad. Miss Jane Marple, who had never been one to lie late, stood at her window and watched the milk float make its way down the high street. The electric vehicle moved with its characteristic whisper, a modern convenience that had replaced the cheerful clatter of horse and cart some years ago. She rather missed the old ways, but one had to admit the electric float was quieter, and dear Joe Peretta, the milkman, seemed to manage it very well. Joe Peretta was a fixture of the village, as much a part of St. Mary Mead as the church tower or the vicarage. He had been delivering milk for nearly 20 years, and there was not a household whose habits he did not know. He knew who took cream on Thursdays, who was cutting back to save pennies, who had guests staying, and who was not quite as prosperous as they pretended. It was extraordinary, Miss Marple often reflected, how much one could learn from the simple matter of milk deliveries. She watched Joe turn the corner toward the better part of the village, where the houses had names rather than numbers, and the gardens were kept by proper gardeners rather than enthusiastic amateurs. Mrs. Farnham lived up there in a handsome house with a walled yard and a view over the fields. A very respectable widow. Mrs. Farnham. Her late husband had been a magistrate, and she carried herself with the dignity appropriate to her position. Miss Marple had heard that Mrs. Farnham's son was away at art school, studying something modern and incomprehensible. The sky was beginning to lighten now, that particular gray that comes before. The sun considers making an appearance. Monsieur Marple moved away from the window and went downstairs to prepare her breakfast. She liked toast soldiers with her boiled egg cut just so, and a pot of proper tea. It was while she was waiting for the kettle to boil that she heard the first whisper of something amiss. A cat yowled somewhere in the distance. Then another sound, a cry that was distinctly human. Miss Marple set down her egg cup and listened. Nothing more came, but she had learned over the years to trust her instincts about such things. She put on her coat and her sensible shoes and let herself out the front door. The frost crunched under her feet as she made her way toward the sound. Other doors were opening now. Mrs. Clement from the bakery appeared, wrapped in a shawl. Mr. Puckle, the baker himself, came out still in his flour-dusted apron, for he had been at his oven since well before dawn. "Did you hear that, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Clement called. "Sounded like it came from up Farnham way." Miss Marple nodded. She had already determined as much. They walked together, a small procession growing as other early risers joined them. By the time they reached the entrance to Mrs. Farnham's yard, there were half a dozen villagers gathered, and the maid from the Farnham house was standing at the gate, her face white as the frost. "It's Joe," the girl gasped. "Mr. Peretta. Oh, miss, I think he's dead." The scene before them was one that would remain etched in Miss Marple's memory. The electric milk float stood at an odd angle, its front wheels against the gate, which had been pushed partway open. Between the float and the gate post lay Joe Peretta, wedged in a space that should not have held a man. His face was turned to one side, and even from where she stood, Miss Marple could see that life had left him. Bottles had smashed when the float struck the gate. Milk pooled on the cobbles, and the silver foil caps glittered like coins in the growing light. The float's cargo crates had shifted, and more bottles stood at precarious angles, waiting to fall. "Someone fetch Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said quietly. "And Inspector Slack should be informed." Mr. Puckle hurried off, grateful for something to do. The others stood in shocked silence. Joe Peretta had been one of their own, a cheerful soul who had never an unkind word for anyone. It seemed impossible that he should lie there broken and still. Miss Marple approached carefully, mindful not to disturb anything. She was not, she reminded herself, a professional detective, but she had lived a long time, and she had observed a great deal about human nature. She had also, through various unhappy circumstances, been present at a number of sudden deaths, and she had learned to notice things. The handbrake lever on the float was in the down position. That was the first thing she observed. The second was the pattern of the spilled milk, arcing forward across the cobbles, as though the float had been moving when the bottles fell. The third was a small detail that caught her eye. A bright circle of blue foil pressed flat against the whetstone, perfect as a newly minted penny. "Terrible thing. Terrible," Mr. Puckle said, returning with the news that Dr. Haydock was on his way. Joe must have forgotten to set the brake proper, and the float rolled on him. "These electric ones, they're quiet, you see. He wouldn't have heard it coming." Said Miss Marple, non-committal. She had bent down now, careful of her knees, and was looking at something on the ground near Joe's hand. His route notebook had fallen from his pocket, the pages splayed open. The last entry, written in Joe's careful hand, read, "Farnham, 2+ cream, note." The word note was underlined twice. Dr. Haydock arrived, a brisk, sensible man who had attended most of the village for 30 years. He made a quick examination and shook his head. "Chest crushed," he said quietly. "Death would have been swift at least. Poor devil." Inspector Slack came puffing up the lane 10 minutes later, red-faced and irritable at being summoned so early. He looked at the scene, at the float with its handbrake down, at the gate, at Joe Peretta's body, and his expression settled into grim certainty. "Accident," he pronounced, clear as day. Handbrake slipped, float rolled, caught him against the gate. Tragic, but there it is. These electric floats, they move quiet. He wouldn't have had time to jump clear. Joe was very careful with the brakes, Mr. Puckle ventured. "Always put a brick behind the wheel on a slope, he did." "Well, he forgot this time," Slack said shortly. "Where's the brick?" "They found it against the wall, lying on its side." "Not crushed," Miss Marple noted. "Not where one would expect if it had been placed properly behind a wheel." Mrs. Farnham appeared then, emerging from her house with admirable composure, considering a man had just died in her yard. She wore a morning dress, and her hair was neatly arranged, though her face was pale. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady. "This is dreadful. Poor Mr. Peretta. I had a headache this morning and was resting. My maid heard the cry and came to fetch me. Is there anything I can do?" "Just a few questions, ma'am," Slack said, already writing in his notebook. "Did you hear anything unusual? See anything?" "Nothing," Mrs. Farnham said. "I was upstairs. I came down when Agnes called me." She looked at the scene, at Joe's body, and for just a moment something flickered across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by proper sympathy. "His poor wife," she murmured. Miss Marple said nothing. She was looking at the float again, at the slight angle it made with the gate, at the splash pattern of the milk. She was thinking about handbrakes and slopes and electric motors. She was thinking about a blue foil cap pressed flat into the cobbles. She was thinking about a notebook entry that said, "Note," with 2 underlines. And she was thinking, as she often did, about human nature and the extraordinary lengths to which people would go to protect what they held dear. By the time Lady Bantry arrived, drawn by the commotion, they were preparing to move Joe's body. Dolly Bantry took one look at the scene and crossed to Miss Marple's side. "Jane," she said quietly, What do you make of this?" Miss Marple glanced at her old friend. "I think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that it is going to require a great deal of thought, and perhaps some careful observation." Inspector Slack was already dismissing the crowd, declaring it an unfortunate accident. "Nothing more to see. The float will be taken to the police yard, Joe's body to the undertaker, and that will be that." "A tragedy, yes, but these things happen." Miss Marple watched it all with her mild blue eyes that missed very little. She saw Mrs. Farnham return to her house, her bearing erect. She saw the maid, Agnes, wringing her hands. She saw the baker, Mr. Puckle, shaking his head sadly. And she saw, because she was looking for it, the faintest mark on the gatepost, a shiny groove, as though something had been drawn tight across it. "Come along to the house, Dolly," she said. "I think we might take some tea, and perhaps discuss this matter a little further." As they walked back through the village, the sun was finally climbing above the horizon, casting long shadows across the frosted ground. It was going to be a clear day, cold but bright. Behind them, in Mrs. Farnham's yard, the milk still pooled on the cobbles, and the blue foil caps glittered in the morning light like small accusing eyes. Chapter 2. Float, Gate, and a Fall. Miss Marple had always maintained that tea was an excellent aid to clear thinking. There was something about the ritual of it, the measured pouring, the careful adding of milk, that allowed one's mind to settle and observe patterns that might otherwise be missed. She and Lady Bantry sat in Miss Marple's small sitting room, where the morning sun now streamed through the windows and made patterns on the carpet. Dolly Bantry had known Jane Marple for more years than either cared to count, and she recognized the expression on her friend's face. "You don't think it was an accident?" Dolly said. It was not a question. Miss Marple set down her cup with precision. "I think," she said carefully, "that there are several small matters that deserve consideration. The handbrake, for instance." Slack seemed quite certain it had slipped. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and perhaps it did. But Joe Peretta had been delivering milk for 20 years. Dolly. Mr. Puckle mentioned that Joe always used a brick on a slope. Always. It seems odd that he should forget on this particular morning. People do forget things. They do indeed. But the brick was lying against the wall, not crushed beneath a wheel. If it had been properly placed and the float had rolled over it, surely it would show some mark." Dolly considered this. "Perhaps he never put it down at all this morning." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or perhaps someone moved it after the fact." There was plaster dust on its edge, fresh plaster dust, as though it had scraped against the wall quite recently. They sipped their tea in silence for a moment. Outside, the village was coming fully to life. The postman cycled past. Mrs. Price from the greengrocer's was setting out her displays. Life continued as it always did, even when death had visited. "What else did you notice?" Dolly asked, for she knew Jane Marple had noticed several things. "The milk," Miss Marple said. "The pattern of the spill. It arced forward across the cobbles, as though the float had been moving with some momentum when the bottles broke. But the yard has only the slightest slope. Dolly, I have walked past Mrs. Farnham's house many times. An electric float, particularly one that is switched off, would need more than that gentle incline to build up speed. Unless someone gave it a push, quite deliberately, or unless the motor was engaged. But Joe would hardly have left the motor running while he opened the gate." Dolly frowned. "So you think someone pushed the float deliberately? But who? And how could they have done it without being seen?" "Those," Miss Marple said, "are excellent questions. I think perhaps we should pay a visit to Mrs. Farnham this afternoon. A condolence call would be quite appropriate, and I did promise to lend her my pattern for the church bazaar tablecloths." Dolly smiled, despite herself. Jane, you are incorrigible. I am merely thorough, dear. There is a difference. They finished their tea, and Miss Marple suggested they take a brief walk before luncheon. The air would do us good, she said, and we might stop by the dairy to express our sympathies to Mr. Blunt, who employed Joe Peretta. It was the sort of thing one did in a village, after all. The dairy stood at the edge of the high street, a substantial building that smelled perpetually of milk and hay. Edgar Blunt was a large man with a florid face and a manner that suggested he was perpetually on the verge of losing his temper. He employed 3 drivers, a clerk, and various yard workers, and he ran his business with an iron hand. Terrible business, Blunt said when they found him in the office. Joe was a good worker, reliable, never late, never shirked. I can't understand how he could be so careless with that brake. Had he been having any difficulties? Miss Marple asked. Any troubles that might have distracted him? Blunt's face darkened. He was behind on his accounts, if you must know. Nothing serious, but he owed me for some shortages. Bottles gone missing, cream that couldn't be accounted for. I'd spoken to him about it. How much did he owe? 37 shillings. Not a fortune, but I run a business, not a charity. I told him he needed to settle up by the end of the month, or there would be consequences. Miss Marple absorbed this information. 37 shillings was not a trivial sum for a working man. It might well have weighed on Joe's mind. They encountered Mavis Dodd on their way out, a sharp-featured young woman who kept the dairy's books and managed the token system. Customers paid in advance for their milk using small metal tokens, and Mavis tracked everyone with meticulous care. Poor Mr. Peretta, Mavis said, her eyes bright with the excitement of tragedy. I saw him just yesterday and he seemed quite himself. Perhaps a bit preoccupied, but nothing more. Did he mention anything unusual? Miss Marple inquired gently. Only that Mrs. Farnham had changed her order. She'd always taken 1 pint daily, but last week she switched to 2 pints and asked for top cream. That's the cream from bottles that have been standing, you see. It's thicker. Joe made a note of it in his book because it was unusual. Mrs. Farnham is generally very particular about waste. I see, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. And this morning, did Joe collect as usual? He left at 5, same as always. He was to do the far end of the village first, then work his way back. Mrs. Farnham's house would have been near the end of his route. They thanked Mavis and walked back toward the village center. Dolly was silent until they were out of earshot of the dairy. Do you think the debt had something to do with it? She asked. Possibly, Miss Marple said. Money troubles have driven many people to desperate acts. Though I confess I am more intrigued by the change in Mrs. Farnham's milk order. Top cream from bottles that have been standing overnight. Why would one suddenly want that? I wonder. Perhaps she was making something special, souffle or a trifle. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she thought it something rather different. They parted at Miss Marple's gate. Dolly promised to return that afternoon for the condolence call. Miss Marple went inside and made herself a light luncheon, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing that scene in the yard, the float at its angle, the spilled milk, the blue foil cap pressed into the cobbles like a marker. After lunch, she took out her knitting and sat by the window, but her needles moved slowly. She was thinking about Joe Peretta's route notebook, about that final entry with its double underlined note. She was thinking about handbrakes and slopes and electric motors. She was thinking about a brick that should have been crushed but wasn't. And she was thinking about something else she had noticed in that early morning light, something so small that she had almost dismissed it. On the rear tire of the float, there had been a chalk mark. 2 marks, actually. One sat at what might have been 5 o'clock on a clock face. The other, fainter, was higher up, as though someone had made a mark and then the wheel had turned. Why would anyone mark a wheel with chalk? Unless, of course, they wanted to know whether it had moved. Miss Marple's needles stopped entirely. She sat very still, looking out at the peaceful, village street at the ordinary folk going, about their ordinary business, and she thought about what it meant when someone wanted to know if a wheel had turned. It meant they expected it to turn when it should have been still. It meant they had planned for it to turn. When Dolly arrived at 3 o'clock, she found Miss Marple putting on her coat and gloves with an air of quiet determination. "We shall pay our call on Mrs. Farnham," Miss Marple said, "and we shall observe very carefully, Dolly. Very carefully indeed." "What are we looking for?" "Details, dear. Always the details. A handbrake does not slip on its own, you know, not unless something makes it slip. And I think if we are very attentive, we might discover what that something was." They walked together through the village, two elderly ladies on an errand of condolence. No one looking at them would have guessed that Miss Marple's mild blue eyes were seeing far more than appeared on the surface. Mrs. Farnham's house stood solid and respectable in the afternoon sun. The yard where Joe Peretta had died was empty now, the milk cleaned up, the float removed. Only a damp patch on the cobbles remained to show where tragedy had struck. Miss Marple paused at the gate and looked at the gate post. In the clear daylight, she could see it more plainly now, a shallow groove in the wood, shiny and smooth, as though something had been drawn tight across it and had worn the surface. She said nothing, but filed the observation away with all the others. They rang the bell, and Agnes the maid admitted them. Mrs. Farnham received them in her drawing room with perfect composure and proper gratitude for their kindness. And Miss Marple, watching her with those deceptively gentle eyes, thought that Mrs. Farnham looked like a woman who had not slept at all. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a broken cream line. Mrs. Farnham's drawing room was precisely what one would expect from a magistrate's widow. Comfortable without being ostentatious, tasteful without being austere. The furniture was good quality, well maintained, and the ornaments on the mantelpiece spoke of respectable foreign travel rather than vulgar extravagance. Mrs. Farnham herself matched her surroundings. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s, with dark hair only lightly touched with gray, and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to being treated with deference. She received their condolences with appropriate gravity. "It is a dreadful thing," she said, pouring tea with steady hands. "Poor Mr. Peretta. I cannot imagine what his family must be suffering. I have sent a note, of course, but it seems so inadequate." "These tragedies are always difficult," Miss Marple murmured. "Had Mr. Peretta been delivering your milk for long?" "Oh, years and years, since before my husband died." "Certainly he was always most reliable." "I confess I still cannot quite understand how such an accident could have occurred. He seemed such a careful man." Dolly accepted her teacup and glanced at Miss Marple, who appeared to be admiring a watercolor on the wall. But Dolly knew her friend well enough to recognize that Jane's attention was elsewhere entirely. Inspector Slack seemed satisfied it was the handbrake, Dolly ventured. "Yes, so I understand." Mrs. Farnham's voice was calm. "These mechanical things can be unpredictable, I suppose. My late husband always said one could never entirely trust modern machinery." Miss Marple turned from the watercolor. "You were unwell this morning, I believe. Such a pity that your headache should have coincided with this unfortunate event." "Yes. I had retired to take some air on the upstairs veranda when I heard the cry. Agnes came running to tell me what had happened, and I telephoned for Dr. Haydock immediately." "Most proper," Miss Marple said. "The shock must have been considerable. I do hope your headache has improved somewhat." "Thank you. These things come and go." They spoke of parish matters for a few minutes, of the upcoming church fete and the Women's Institute meeting. It was all perfectly ordinary conversation. But when Agnes came in with fresh hot water for the tea, Miss Marple made a small request. "I wonder, Mrs. Farnham, if I might trouble you for a glass of water. The tea is lovely, but I find I'm rather thirsty after our walk." "Of course." Mrs. Farnham nodded to Agnes, who disappeared into the kitchen. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the window as though to admire the view. "What a pleasant aspect you have. The garden must be delightful in summer." "Yes, my late husband took great pride in it." Agnes returned with a glass on a small tray, and Miss Marple thanked her. As the maid set down the tray, Miss Marple happened to glance at the kitchen jug from which the water had been poured. It was a cream-colored earthenware piece, quite ordinary, and beside it on the tray sat an empty milk bottle. The bottle caught Miss Marple's eye because the cream line inside it was absolutely perfect. A straight, clean separation between the cream and the milk below, undisturbed and serene. "Your milk keeps very well," Miss Marple observed. "That must be from yesterday's delivery." Mrs. Farnham glanced at the bottle. "Yes, I believe so. We keep it cool in the larder, of course." "Most sensible." When they left half an hour later, having expressed their sympathies once more, Dolly waited until they were well away from the house before speaking. "Well," she said, "what did you learn?" "Several things," Miss Marple replied. "But first, Dolly, I think we should walk back past Mrs. Farnham's gate. There is something I wish to examine." They retraced their steps. The air was quiet now, peaceful in the afternoon sun, but on the doorstep, exactly where a milkman would have left it that morning, stood a single bottle. Miss Marple bent down with some difficulty and peered at it closely. Then she straightened, her face thoughtful. "How very interesting," she said. "What is it?" "Look at the cream line, Dolly." Dolly bent to examine the bottle. Unlike the perfect separation in the kitchen jug, this bottle's cream was disturbed. The line was broken into feathery streaks, as though the milk had been shaken after it had settled. "Perhaps it was jostled when Joe delivered it," Dolly suggested. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But cream takes several hours to rise and form that clean line we saw in yesterday's bottle. This bottle should have been undisturbed since Joe placed it here just after 6 o'clock this morning, and yet the cream is thoroughly mixed. What could have disturbed it so violently in the few hours since the float hit the gate?" "The vibration?" "The bottle was on the doorstep, Dolly, several yards from where the float struck, and it is still standing upright, unbroken." "No, I think this bottle was shaken by something else entirely, something sudden and forceful." They walked slowly back toward the village center. Miss Marple was silent, her mind clearly occupied with the puzzle. "Jane," Dolly said at last, "what are you thinking?" "I am thinking about momentum," Miss Marple replied, "and about the differences between bottles, one with a perfect cream line that has stood peacefully all night, and another with a broken cream line that should have been equally still. It suggests movement, you see, sudden movement." "You've lost me entirely," Miss Marple smiled. "Never mind, dear. It is only a theory at present, but I should very much like to know what time Joe Peretta actually delivered that bottle this morning." They encountered Dr. Haydock outside his surgery. He greeted them with his usual bluff good humor, though his expression grew sober when they mentioned their visit to Mrs. Farnham. "Dreadful business," he said. The chest was crushed completely. Death would have been nearly instantaneous, which is some small mercy. The float was heavy. "I suppose," Dolly said. "Indeed, and even an electric vehicle, if it has built up sufficient momentum, can do terrible damage." The angle of impact was quite precise. Unfortunately for poor Peretta, it caught him just so. He demonstrated with his hands. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said, "would you say the float must have been moving with some speed?" "Oh, certainly. A slow roll wouldn't have done it. There must have been real momentum behind the impact." "I see. Thank you, Doctor. That is most helpful." After Dr. Haydock had gone, Dolly turned to her friend. "What are you piecing together, Jane?" "Fragments, Dolly, only fragments as yet. But I keep returning to that chalk mark on the tire. If someone made a mark before the wheel turned, and the wheel did indeed turn, then someone expected it to move. And if they expected it to move, they must have had a reason for that expectation. You think someone made the float roll deliberately? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that a handbrake does not release itself. Nor does a heavy electric float simply begin rolling without cause. The yard has a slope, yes, but a very gentle one. Something must have started the float moving. Something, or someone. They had reached Miss Marple's gate. The afternoon was drawing toward evening now, and the village was settling into that quiet hour before supper. "Will you come in for sherry?" Miss Marple asked. "I think not, Jane. My head is spinning with all these details. Chalk marks and cream lines and handbrakes. I confess I cannot see how they fit together." "Nor can I quite yet," Miss Marple admitted. "But they do fit, Dolly. Of that I am certain. One simply needs to discover the pattern." After Dolly had gone, Miss Marple sat in her chair and took up her knitting. But her needles moved mechanically while her mind worked elsewhere. She was thinking about a bottle with a broken cream line and another with a perfect one. She was thinking about chalk marks on a tire and plaster dust on a brick. She was thinking about Mrs. Farnham's steady hands and Agnes's white face. And she was thinking about time. The time Joe delivered the milk, the time the cry was heard, the time Mrs. Farnham appeared from upstairs. Time and how it could be manipulated by someone clever enough to arrange things just so. Outside her window, the milk float from the dairy passed on its evening collection round. A different driver now, for Joe Peretta would never make his rounds again. Miss Marple watched it go, her needles clicking steadily, her mind assembling pieces of a puzzle that was just beginning to show its shape. Chapter 4. The Handbrake That Slipped. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with that crystalline quality to the air that makes every sound carry further than usual. Miss Marple was up early, as was her habit, and after a modest breakfast, she put on her warmest coat and set out for a walk. Her destination was the police yard, where she had learned from the postman Inspector Slack had ordered the milk float to be taken for examination. Not that Slack believed there was anything to examine, but procedure was procedure, even in cases that seemed perfectly straightforward. She found the inspector standing beside the float looking distinctly annoyed. A constable stood nearby, notebook in hand, clearly wishing he were elsewhere. "Miss Marple," Slack said with barely concealed exasperation, "I might have known you'd turn up. This is police business, you know." "Of course, Inspector. I was merely passing and thought I might observe." "One learns so much by observation, don't you find?" Slack grunted. He had dealt with Miss Marple before and knew better than to dismiss her entirely, though it went against his grain to admit she sometimes noticed things that escaped official scrutiny. "There's nothing to observe," he said. "Handbrake failed, float rolled, man died. Tragedy, but not a mystery." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. She moved closer to the float, her keen eyes taking in every detail. "Mr. Blunt mentioned that Joe Peretta always used a brick as a chalk. Did you find it in position against the wall?" Slack admitted it, but he obviously forgot to place it behind the wheel this time. "Men get careless." Joe Peretta had been doing this work for 20 years, Miss Marple observed. It seems unusual that he should suddenly forget such a basic precaution. People forget. They get distracted. Miss Marple said nothing. She was examining the brick which the constable had placed on a nearby bench. The edge showed that curious mark she had noticed before, a fresh scraping of white plaster dust. "This brick has been moved recently," she said. "You can see where it scraped against the wall. But if it had been crushed beneath a moving wheel, surely it would show quite different damage." Slack frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting nothing, Inspector. Merely observing. May I look at the handbrake mechanism?" With obvious reluctance, Slack allowed her to approach. The handbrake lever was a simple affair designed to lock the rear wheels when pulled up. Miss Marple bent down, mindful of her joints, and peered at it closely. "How very interesting," she murmured. "What now?" the pale-toothed inspector asked. "The pawl tooth, the part that engages with the ratchet to hold the brake in position. It's quite clean, isn't it? Almost polished. And yet the rest of the mechanism is grimy with winter dirt and old grease." Slack looked where she pointed. It was true that the pawl tooth showed an unusual cleanliness compared to the surrounding metalwork, but he was not about to let an elderly spinster dictate his investigation. "Metal gets polished through use," he said. "Nothing suspicious about that." "Quite so. Though I wonder why only this particular part should be so clean while everything around it is so dirty. And there's a faint smell of oil. Fresh oil. Not the old grease one sees elsewhere." "You're imagining things, Miss Marple." "Perhaps I am, Inspector. I'm quite old after all, and my faculties may be declining." But her eyes, meeting his, were sharp as ever, and Slack had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing things he had missed. Miss Marple moved to the gatepost, which had been brought along with the float. She ran her gloved finger along a shallow groove in the wood. "This mark is quite smooth," she said, as though something had been drawn across it repeatedly or under tension. "And see here." She pointed to a tiny catch in the wood. "A fiber, Inspector. Cotton, unless I'm much mistaken, caught in the splinter." Slack examined the gatepost more closely. There was indeed a fiber so small he had overlooked it entirely. He extracted it carefully and held it up to the light. "Could be from anything," he said. "A clothesline, laundry, completely innocent." "Could be," Miss Marple agreed. "Though it does seem an odd place for a clothesline fiber to lodge, don't you think? Unless, of course, a line had been stretched from the gate to somewhere else under considerable tension to wear the wood so smooth. You're building castles in the air." "Miss Marple." "Very possibly, Inspector. But humor me for a moment. Suppose someone wanted to release this handbrake from a distance. Suppose they attached a cord to the lever, ran it over the gatepost where it would have leverage, and pulled. The brake would release, the float would roll, and the person pulling would be safely away from the scene." Slack's face reddened. "That's nonsense, pure speculation. Why would anyone do such a thing?" "That," Miss Marple said gently, "would depend on what Joe Peretta knew, wouldn't it? And on whether someone wished him to remain silent." She examined the handbrake lever itself, now running her finger along its surface. "There's a mark here as well, Inspector. A slight polish where something might have been hitched around the lever. A cord perhaps looped and pulled tight. You're seeing what you want to see?" "Am I? Let me ask you something, Inspector. How steep is the slope in Mrs. Farnham's yard?" "Barely noticeable." "Precisely. And yet Dr. Haydock said the float must have been moving with considerable momentum to cause such injuries." "How does a float build up speed on a barely noticeable slope?" Slack opened his mouth and closed it again. It was a fair question, and he had no immediate answer. "Perhaps," Miss Marple continued, "it had assistance. A good push, or a sudden release when it was positioned just right. The chalk mark on the rear tire suggests someone wanted to know if the wheel had moved. Why mark a wheel unless you expect it to move when it shouldn't?" "I don't hold with theories," Slack said stubbornly. "I deal in facts." "Then let us consider the facts," Miss Marple said. "Fact. The brick was not crushed but scraped against a wall. Fact. The handbrake pawel is suspiciously clean and oiled. Fact. There is a groove in the gatepost with cotton fiber caught in it. Fact. The float's momentum was greater than the slope would naturally produce. These are all facts, Inspector. The question is what story they tell when taken together." Slack glared at the float as though it had personally offended him. Even if someone did release the brake deliberately, which I'm not admitting, how could they do it without being seen? Mrs. Farnham was upstairs with a headache. The maid was in the kitchen. Joe was at the gate. There was nobody else about at that hour. That, Miss Marple said, is what makes it clever. The killer didn't need to be present at the gate. They only needed to be somewhere with a view of it. Somewhere they could pull a cord and release the brake at precisely the right moment. From where? The yard is walled. From above, Inspector. From an upstairs window, perhaps Mrs. Farnham's house overlooks the yard quite admirably. Slack's expression changed. You're suggesting Mrs. Farnham. I am suggesting nothing. I'm merely observing that certain facts align in a particular way. Whether they align by coincidence or design is what we must determine. She turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, Inspector. You might wish to examine the upstairs windows of Mrs. Farnham's house, specifically the window that overlooks the yard gate. I should be curious to know if there are any marks on the sash. Any signs that something might have been attached there recently? I can't go poking about a respectable widow's house on your say-so, Slack protested. No, of course not. But you might ask permission to examine the scene of the accident more thoroughly, for the sake of completeness. You understand, just to satisfy yourself that every detail has been properly documented. She smiled at him. That mild, innocent smile that made men underestimate her so consistently. Good day, Inspector. I do hope you find this matter concluded to your satisfaction. As she walked back toward the village, Miss Marple considered what she'd learned. The evidence was accumulating piece by careful piece. A handbrake that had been deliberately oiled to release smoothly. A gate post worn by cord. A brick moved aside rather than crushed. Someone had arranged Joe Peretta's death with considerable care. Someone who understood mechanics well enough to make it look accidental. Someone who had access to Mrs. Farnham's upstairs rooms. The question was whether that someone was Mrs. Farnham herself, or whether she was being very cleverly framed. Miss Marple had her suspicions, but suspicions were not proof. What she needed now were more facts, more small details that would either confirm or refute her theory, and she knew exactly where to look for them. Chapter 5. Blue Foil. Red Tokens. Miss Marple had always believed that the smallest details often proved the most illuminating. It was in the overlooked trifles, the everyday objects that people handled without conscious thought, that the truth frequently revealed itself, which was why she found herself later that morning making her way back to the dairy. The building was busy now, with deliveries being loaded and returns being counted. The loss of Joe Peretta had disrupted the routine, and Edgar Blunt was in a foul temper as a result. Another driver short. He was bellowing at someone in the yard. Can't afford to run a charity, can I? Miss Marple slipped past him and found Mavis Dodd at her desk in the small office, surrounded by ledgers and the paraphernalia of careful accounting. The young woman looked up as Miss Marple entered. Oh, Miss Marple, I'm afraid Mr. Blunt is rather occupied just now. It's you I wish to speak with, my dear. If you can spare a moment. Mavis glanced toward the yard where Blunt was still haranguing the unfortunate driver, then nodded. I have a few minutes. What is it you need? I was wondering about Mrs. Farnham's account. You mentioned she had changed her order recently. Yes, last week from 1 pint daily to 2 pints, and she asked specifically for top cream. That's the cream from bottles that have been standing. You see, it's richer. And Joe made a note of it in his book. He wrote "note" with an exclamation mark. I remember because he showed me. He thought it was odd, you see. Mrs. Farnham had always been most particular about taking just what she needed, never any waste. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And the tokens, she pays in advance, I presume. Everyone does. We issue tokens at the beginning of the week. Red for ordinary service, blue for special requests. Mrs. Farnham had red tokens. Of course. Might I see the token jar for Mrs. Farnham, I mean? Mavis hesitated, then reached for a wooden box divided into compartments, each labeled with a customer's name. She extracted a small glass jar marked Farnham and held it up. Inside were several red metal discs, each stamped with the dairy's mark. "How many should there be?" Miss Marple asked. Mavis consulted her ledger. She purchased 7 on Monday for the week's delivery. There should be 2 remaining for Saturday and Sunday. And are there? Mavis tipped the jar and counted. Yes, 2 red tokens. But that's odd. What is, dear? These tokens weren't here yesterday evening. I'm certain of it. The jar was empty when I locked up. Yet this morning at 5 or 6, when I came to fetch some string from the back room, I found 2 tokens sitting on the counter. I assumed Joe had collected them from Mrs. Farnham and left them for me to record. But Joe was already... The accident had already occurred by then. Yes. Mavis's face paled. I never thought of that. If Joe didn't leave them, who did? Miss Marple's expression was gentle but intent. At what time did you arrive this morning? 6 o'clock. Same as always. The tokens were on the counter by 6:05. I'm sure of it. I noticed them when I went to the back room. And you saw no one? No one. Mr. Blunt was in the cold room checking the stock. The drivers were loading their floats. I was alone in the office. Could someone have come in from the street? The front door wasn't locked. We opened at 6 for early customers who need milk before work, but I didn't hear anyone. Miss Marple thanked her and turned to leave, then paused. One more question, if I may. Does Mrs. Farnham usually return her tokens promptly? Oh, yes. She's very particular about settling her account. Never lets things accumulate. Outside, Miss Marple stood for a moment in thought. 2 tokens returned at 6:05, yet Joe Peretta had died sometime around 6:15. The timing was significant. Someone had returned those tokens early, before the tragedy occurred. Someone who wanted it to appear that the account was settled, that there was no reason for Joe to make a second visit to the house. But why would he need to make a second visit? She made her way to the post office, where Agnes Reed presided over stamps and parcels with brisk efficiency. Agnes was a fountain of village information, observing everything that passed through her establishment with keen interest. Good morning, Miss Marple. How may I help you? I'm looking for some parcel twine, Agnes. Nothing fancy, just ordinary string. Of course. Agnes reached for a roll. Will 20 feet be sufficient? I think so. Yes. Tell me, did Mrs. Farnham purchase twine recently? I believe she mentioned something about parcels for her son. Agnes's face brightened with the pleasure of shared knowledge. Why, yes, just yesterday afternoon. She bought a good length of parcel twine, and a new clothesline as well, the strong sort. Said her old one had frayed. How fortunate that she noticed before it broke entirely. Indeed, nothing worse than washing falling into the dirt. Miss Marple paid for her twine and walked slowly homeward. Her mind was assembling the pieces with growing certainty. Mrs. Farnham had purchased twine and a clothesline the day before Joe's death. 2 tokens had been returned early on the morning of the death, before Joe reached the Farnham house for what should have been his only visit of the day. But his notebook had said, Farnham 2 plus cream, note. With that emphatic exclamation, why note? What was unusual about delivering 2 pints and cream? Unless the cream was meant to come from yesterday's bottles, top cream, the kind that rises only after milk has stood overnight. The kind that would prove bottles had been in the house overnight. Miss Marple stopped walking. She stood very still on the pavement, her gloved hands clasped on her handbag, her mind racing ahead to the inevitable conclusion. If Joe had noticed bottles left overnight when Mrs. Farnham claimed to use her milk daily, what would that suggest? What would it prove? That someone had stayed the night, someone whose presence needed concealing. And if Joe, with his knowledge of every household's habits and secrets, had realized this, and perhaps hinted at it, what then? A magistrate's widow, careful of her reputation, would have much to lose. 37 shillings might seem a small sum for continued discretion, unless Joe had wanted more, unless he had overplayed his hand. She resumed walking, her pace measured but purposeful. There was more to uncover yet, more small details to confirm or refute her theory, but the shape of the thing was becoming clear. Someone had purchased twine and clothesline. Someone had returned tokens early to suggest no second visit was needed. Someone had arranged for Joe Peretta to come twice to a particular house at particular times. And someone had pulled a cord from above, releasing a handbrake and sending a heavy float rolling toward an unsuspecting man. The question now was proof. Theory was one thing, evidence quite another. Inspector Slack would need more than suppositions about cream lines and token timing. Miss Marple quickened her step. There were still clues to find, still details that would make the pattern complete. And she knew with a certainty born of long experience with human nature exactly where those details would be found. Chapter 6: Alibis by Bakery Yard and Bedroom. Inspector Slack, despite his reluctance to entertain Miss Marple's theories, was nothing if not thorough when duty demanded it. By afternoon, he had assembled the relevant parties in the parish hall to establish a precise timeline of that fateful morning. Miss Marple, who happened to be passing and was graciously invited to observe, took a seat near the back and opened her knitting bag. Her needles began their steady rhythm while her eyes remained alert. Slack consulted his notebook. Right then, let's establish where everyone was between 6 and 6:20 on the morning of the incident. Mr. Puckle, you're the baker. You were up early, I presume. Mr. Puckle, still dusted with flour despite having changed his apron, nodded vigorously. Up at 4, Inspector, same as every day these 40 years. Had the ovens fired and the first batch of bread in by 5. And you saw Joe Peretta? I did. About 5 minutes before 6, 5:55 by my watch, which keeps good time. He waved as he passed, cheerful as always. Morning, Mr. Puckle, he called. Cold enough for you? That's what he said. Last words I heard from him. Slack made a note. So Peretta was alive and well at 5:55. Anyone else see him after that? There was a brief silence. Then Dr. Cray spoke up. He was a handsome young man, perhaps 30, with the smooth manner of one accustomed to making favorable impressions. I cycled past Farnham Lane at 7 minutes past 6, he said. I was called to old Mrs. Hobbs, who'd taken a turn in the night. I came down the high street, turned into Farnham Lane, and went on to her cottage. I saw nothing unusual. You didn't see Peretta or the float? No, Inspector. The lane was empty as far as I could tell in that light. I was in rather a hurry. And what time did you reach Mrs. Hobbs? 6:15, perhaps a minute or two after. The old lady's nephew can confirm it. He was the one who telephoned for me. Slack made another note. Mrs. Farnham, you were at home, I believe. Mrs. Farnham, composed in a dark dress with her hair neatly pinned, inclined her head. I was upstairs. I had woken with a severe headache and had gone to the veranda for air. Fresh air often helps, I find. What time was this? Shortly after 6:04, perhaps. I was there when I heard the cry from the yard. Agnes, my maid, heard it as well and came running up to find me. I immediately telephoned Dr. Haydock. And before that, you heard nothing unusual? Nothing at all, Inspector. The house was quite silent. Agnes, the maid, twisted her apron nervously. I was in the kitchen, sir, preparing Mrs. Farnham's morning tray. I heard the cry at about 6:04 and ran to tell the mistress. She was on the upstairs veranda, just as she said. Slack turned to Edgar Blunt. You were at the dairy, I understand. Been there since 5, Blunt said gruffly. Always am. Can't run a dairy from your bed, can you? I was in the cold room checking stock when I heard the commotion. And Miss Dodd. Mavis Dodd sat with her hands folded primly. I arrived at 6 o'clock, Inspector. I was at my desk by 2 minutes past. I saw no one unusual. Heard nothing out of the ordinary until Mr. Blunt came in saying there had been an accident. Slack reviewed his notes with a frown. The timeline was straightforward enough. Peretta had been seen alive at 5:55. By 6:15, he was dead. In that 20-minute window, every person present had an alibi that seemed solid. Mr. Puckle had been at his ovens with customers coming and going. Dr. Cray had been cycling to a medical call, confirmed by witnesses. Blunt had been in the dairy cold room. Mavis had been at her desk. Mrs. Farnham had been upstairs with a headache, confirmed by her maid. It all seemed entirely innocent. An accident. Pure and simple. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady clicking. She appeared absorbed in her knitting, but her mind was working along different lines entirely. The timeline was indeed revealing, but not in the way Inspector Slack supposed. It was revealing because of what it concealed, not what it showed. Mrs. Farnham claimed to have been on the veranda at 6:04, yet she had also been there to hear the cry. How convenient that she should be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. And Dr. Cray cycling past at 6:07, seeing nothing, but Farnham Lane connected directly to the yard where Joe died. If the doctor had truly passed at that time, he should have seen or heard something, unless the tragedy had not yet occurred. Unless Joe had been at the Farnham house earlier than his final visit. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment, then resumed. 2 visits. That was the key. Joe had been to the house twice that morning, once early, once later. The double chalk mark on the tire confirmed it. The notation in his route book confirmed it. The tokens returned early confirmed it. Someone had arranged for Joe to come twice, someone who needed him in a specific place at a specific time. Slack was wrapping up his inquiry. Well, it all seems clear enough. Peretta made his delivery. The brake slipped and he was caught. Tragic but accidental. Unless anyone has anything further to add. Miss Marple raised her hand with gentle diffidence. If I might ask one small question, Inspector, Slack sighed. Yes, Miss Marple? Mrs. Farnham, you mentioned being on the veranda for air. Was that the upstairs veranda that overlooks the yard? Yes, it is. And you saw nothing unusual, no movement in the yard before the accident? Mrs. Farnham's composure remained perfect. Nothing at all. As I said, I was there only briefly, for the air, of course. And the veranda railing, is it quite sturdy? One wouldn't want to lean too heavily? It's perfectly sound, I assure you. Miss Marple smiled. I'm certain it is. I merely wondered because I noticed yesterday when we called that there seemed to be a slight mark on the rail, a sort of polish, as though something had rubbed against it. The room had gone very quiet. Mrs. Farnham's face remained impassive. I couldn't say. Perhaps the maid polished it. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. Agnes, did you polish the veranda rail recently? Agnes looked confused. No, miss. Not for weeks. The upstairs veranda isn't used much in winter. I see. Thank you, dear. Slack was looking between Miss Marple and Mrs. Farnham with growing suspicion. What are you getting at? Nothing at all, Inspector. Merely curious about household details. I'm an old woman, you understand. These small matters interest me. But her eyes, meeting Mrs. Farnham's across the room, were sharp and knowing. The meeting broke up shortly after. As people filed out, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and made her way slowly toward the door. She paused beside Dr. Haydock. Doctor, you examined Mr. Peretta. The injury suggested a considerable impact, you said. Yes, substantial force. The float must have been moving at a fair speed. And the time of death, between 6 and 6:20, I'd estimate. Difficult to be more precise. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Doctor. Most helpful. Outside Lady Bantry was waiting. Well, she demanded, what did you learn? That everyone has an alibi, Miss Marple said. And that alibis, Dolly, can sometimes tell us more than they conceal. Chapter 7. The Clothesline Cut. It was Lady Bantry who suggested they pay another call on Mrs. Farnham. Not an official visit this time, but rather a friendly gesture. The sort of neighborly attention one paid to someone who had experienced an unpleasant shock. "We might bring her some of Cook's seed cake," Dolly proposed. "Everyone knows tragedy is easier to bear with proper cake," Miss Marple agreed, though her reasons for the visit had little to do with seed cake and much to do with what she hoped to observe in Mrs. Farnham's bedroom. They arrived mid-afternoon, when the light was still good. Mrs. Farnham received them in the drawing-room with her usual composure, though Miss Marple detected a weariness in her eyes that had not been present at their first visit. "How kind of you to call again," Mrs. Farnham said, accepting the cake with appropriate gratitude. "Please do sit down. I'll ask Agnes to bring tea." While they waited, Miss Marple remarked on a framed sketch hanging near the window. "What a charming piece. Your son's work, I presume." "Yes, Philip did that last summer. He's studying at the Slade, you know. Modern techniques, though I confess I prefer more traditional styles myself." "How lovely that young people can pursue their passions." "You must miss him while he's away." "I do, rather. But it's important for him to have his independence." Agnes brought the tea, and they spoke of inconsequential matters for a suitable interval. Then Miss Marple, with the apologetic air of an elderly lady with certain requirements, asked if she might use the facilities. "Of course," Mrs. Farnham said. "Agnes will show you upstairs." "No need to trouble her," Miss Marple said quickly. "If you'll just direct me, I'm sure I can manage. First door at the top of the stairs on the right." Miss Marple made her way upstairs with careful steps, though her progress was rather swifter than her careful demeanor suggested. At the top of the stairs she paused. The door to the right was indeed the bathroom, but the door at the end of the corridor stood ajar, revealing what was clearly Mrs. Farnham's bedroom. A quick glance downstairs confirmed that Agnes was occupied with the tea things, and Dolly was keeping Mrs. Farnham engaged in conversation about the church flower rhoda. Miss Marple moved quietly to the bedroom door. The room was well appointed and meticulously tidy. The bed was made with military precision, the dressing table organized with care, but it was the window that interested Miss Marple. She crossed to it and examined the sash. The view, as she had suspected, looked directly down onto the yard where Joe Peretta had died. The angle was perfect. One could see the gate, the cobbled area where the float had stood. Everything. She bent closer to the window frame. The top rail of the lower sash bore a mark, faint but distinct, a smear of black grease, the kind used on mechanical parts to reduce friction. It was not the sort of mark one would expect from ordinary household use. Miss Marple straightened and looked around the room. A large linen press stood against one wall. She opened it carefully, mindful of creaking hinges. Inside, neatly folded sheets and towels were arranged with precision, but on the top shelf, coiled loosely, was a length of new clothesline. She lifted it out and examined the end. It had been cut cleanly with a sharp blade, not frayed from wear, as one would expect from an old line that needed replacing. More tellingly, the coil was several feet shorter than a standard clothesline should be. Miss Marple replaced it carefully and closed the press. As she turned to leave, something on the bedside table caught her eye. A book lay there, a volume of poetry, and beneath it, partially visible, was a milk token. She lifted the book and picked up the token. It was one of the dairy's red tokens, but it bore a distinctive mark, a smear of black grease, the same type that stained the window sash. The implications were clear. Someone had handled the token with greasy fingers, fingers that had been oiling a mechanical part, the handbrake pawel. Perhaps. Miss Marple slipped the token into her pocket and replaced the book. She heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly moved to the bathroom, flushing the toilet and running the tap for verisimilitude. When she descended, Mrs. Farnham looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Did you find everything satisfactorily?" "Yes, thank you, my dear." "What a pleasant outlook you have from upstairs." "The yard must be quite convenient for household deliveries." "Yes, the tradesmen use the back gate." "Very sensible. And your bedroom window overlooks it, I noticed." "You must be able to see anyone coming or going." Mrs. Farnham's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "I suppose so." "I don't spend much time looking out of windows." "Of course not." "Though on the morning of the accident, you mentioned being on the veranda." "That's just adjacent to your bedroom, isn't it?" "Yes." "And you saw nothing unusual in the yard before the tragedy?" "Nothing at all, Miss Marple, as I told Inspector Slack." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I was admiring your linen press, so beautifully organized. I noticed you have a new clothesline. Very practical to keep a spare." The cup rattled again. "Yes, my old one was fraying. One must be prepared." "Indeed, though I confess I was puzzled. The new line seemed rather short. Perhaps it was cut to a particular length for a specific purpose." "I don't recall." "Agnes may have cut it. I leave such matters to her." But Agnes, summoned to pour more hot water, looked blank when questioned. "A clothesline, ma'am?" "I haven't touched the one in the press." "I didn't know we had a new one." The silence that followed was brief but telling. Mrs. Farnham recovered quickly. "I must have purchased it myself and forgotten. So many small errands, one loses track." "Quite natural," Miss Marple agreed. "Though Agnes at the post office mentioned you bought one just the day before the accident, along with some parcel twine for sending things to your son. I believe." Mrs. Farnham's composure was remarkable, but Miss Marple saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the minute tensing of her shoulders. "Yes, I do send Philip parcels occasionally." "How thoughtful, though I notice you haven't sent anything recently. The unused twine is still in the kitchen drawer. I saw it yesterday when Agnes brought the water. Curious that you should buy twine and clothesline and then not use either for their intended purpose. I may have changed my mind about sending the parcel." "Of course, or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "the twine and clothesline were needed for something else entirely, something urgent and secret." Dolly, sensing the tension, set down her cup with a decisive click. "Jane, I think we've imposed long enough. Mrs. Farnham must have many things to attend to." They made their farewells with proper courtesy. Mrs. Farnham saw them to the door, with rigid politeness. As they walked down the garden path, Miss Marple glanced back once. Mrs. Farnham stood in the doorway, watching them with an expression that was difficult to read. "Jane," Dolly said as soon as they were out of earshot, "what on earth was all that about clotheslines and twine?" "Evidence, Dolly. Small pieces of evidence that tell a story. A clothesline purchased the day before Joe died, now cut short. A window sash smeared with mechanical grease. A milk token with the same grease on it, hidden beneath a book on Mrs. Farnham's bedside table." "What does it mean?" "It means," Miss Marple said, "that someone arranged a very clever mechanism, a cord run from the handbrake over the gate post up to the bedroom window. When pulled from above, it would release the brake and send the float rolling. The clothesline would have been perfect for such a purpose, strong and flexible. But that would mean Mrs. Farnham. It would mean someone with access to that bedroom." "Yes." "Whether Mrs. Farnham herself or someone else remains to be determined, though the evidence is accumulating rather specifically." "I'm afraid." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Dolly said quietly, "You're going to prove she murdered Joe Peretta, aren't you?" "I'm going to prove what happened," Miss Marple corrected. "The truth, whatever it may be." "That is rather different from seeking to convict anyone in particular." But her face was grave, and she knew that the truth, once fully revealed, would leave little doubt as to who had pulled that cord from above. Chapter 8. Ledger. One House Twice. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most damning evidence often resided not in dramatic revelations, but in the mundane records of daily life, ledgers, account books, delivery records. These were the repositories of truth that people forgot to falsify because they seemed so ordinary, which was why she returned to the dairy the following morning, this time with a specific purpose. Mavis Dodd was at her desk as usual, her neat handwriting filling in columns with mathematical precision. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, a flicker of weariness crossing her features. "Miss Marple, can I help you with something?" "I hope so, my dear." "I was thinking about what you said regarding Joe's route. He was very methodical, wasn't he? Kept careful records." "Oh, yes. Mr. Blunt insisted on it. Every delivery had to be marked on the tally stick, and Joe kept his own notebook as well, for special instructions." "His tally stick, might I see it?" Mavis hesitated. "I suppose there's no harm. The police have finished with it." She retrieved a wooden stick from a drawer, notched and marked in a system that would have meant nothing to the casual observer, but was perfectly clear to those who understood it. Miss Marple studied it carefully. Each notch represented a delivery, grouped by route. She ran her finger along the marks for the morning of Joe's death, counting silently. "How peculiar," she murmured. "What?" "There are 2 notches. For Farnham, one here with the early deliveries and another here with the later ones. Why would Joe deliver to the same house twice in one morning?" Mavis leaned over to look. "That is odd. I never noticed. Perhaps he forgot something on the first visit and had to go back." "Perhaps. Do you have his route notebook? The one that was in his pocket when he died?" Inspector Slack took it, but I copied the relevant entries into our ledger. "Let me show you." She opened a large bound book and turned to the current week's entries. "Here, Thursday morning's deliveries. Joe noted each house and what was left. And here's Farnham, 2 pints plus cream. Note that exclamation mark. That's what I mentioned before." "Yes, but look at the time notations in the margin. Do you see a tiny pencil tick at 5:40 and another at 6:10? 2 different times." Mavis peered closely. "You're right. I never paid attention to those. They're so faint, but very significant. Joe went to the Farnham house at 5:40 and again at 6:10. The first time would have been early in his route, the second near the end. Why 2 visits? I can't imagine, unless Mrs. Farnham asked him to come back for some reason." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "Yes, I rather think she did." "Mavis, dear, do you recall anything else unusual about Mrs. Farnham's order? You mentioned she asked about returning cream if it was short." Mavis's face brightened with recollection. "Yes. Just 2 days before Joe died, she came into the dairy and asked if Joe could bring cream back if she found she didn't need it all. Said she might have over-ordered. I told her we don't usually do returns, but for a good customer we could make an exception. She seemed very particular about the timing, wanted to know exactly when Joe would be on Farnham Lane." "Did she indeed? And what did you tell her?" "That he'd be there about 6 o'clock in the morning, give or take a few minutes, depending on the rest of the route." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pattern was becoming clearer. Mrs. Farnham had wanted to know Joe's exact timing. She had arranged for him to have a reason to return. The cream request had been a ruse, a way to ensure Joe would come back to the house at a specific, predictable time. "Mavis, you've been very helpful. Just one more question. The tokens that were returned on the morning of the accident, you said you found them on the counter at 6:05. "Yes, exactly. But Joe's first visit would have been at 5:40, and his second not until 6:10, so he couldn't have left the tokens on either visit." "Who else could have returned them?" Mavis's face paled as understanding dawned. "You mean someone wanted it to look as though the account was settled? So there'd be no reason for Joe to come back? Precisely. But Joe had already arranged to come back for the cream. The tokens being returned early was meant to disguise that second visit as his own idea, not something Mrs. Farnham had requested. But why would Mrs. Farnham want to disguise a second visit? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Because that second visit was when she intended to kill him, my dear. The first visit established the pattern, placed the float in position, allowed her to check the mechanism. The second visit, when he returned for the cream that was never really needed, was when she pulled the cord and released the brake. Mavis sat down heavily. I can't believe it. Mrs. Farnham, a murderer? But why? What had Joe done? I believe he saw something, or realized something, that Mrs. Farnham could not afford to have revealed. You remember the note in his book? I think that referred to the bottle standing overnight. Top cream only forms when bottles haven't been used immediately. It would prove someone had stayed the night, at a house where only a widow should be living. Dr. Cray, Mavis whispered. Everyone knows he's been calling there at odd hours. They say it's medical visits, but quite. And a magistrate's widow cannot afford scandal. Her position in society, her son's prospects, everything depended on maintaining appearances. If Joe hinted at what he knew, perhaps suggested he'd need to be compensated for his discretion. 37 shillings. That's what Joe owed Mr. Blunt. If Mrs. Farnham had paid him to keep quiet, he could have settled his debt. Exactly, but I suspect Joe wanted more than 37 shillings, or perhaps Mrs. Farnham realized that paying once meant paying forever. Either way, she chose a more permanent solution. Mavis looked stricken. What will you do? I shall speak with Inspector Slack. The evidence is circumstantial, but it's accumulating into a rather compelling picture. The double delivery, the early return of tokens, the clothesline and grease, the timing of Mrs. Farnham's supposed headache. It all fits together rather neatly. Will it be enough to convict her? That, Miss Marple said, will be for a jury to decide. But truth has a way of emerging, Mavis. It may take time, but it does emerge. She thanked the young woman and made her way out into the morning air. The village was going about its business. Ordinary people doing ordinary things. A postman cycled past. A dog barked somewhere. Life continued, oblivious to the dark currents that ran beneath its placid surface. Miss Marple walked slowly homeward, her mind reviewing the evidence piece by piece. The double notation in the ledger confirmed what the chalk marks and the broken cream line had suggested. Joe had been at the Farnham house twice. The first visit had been innocent enough. The second had been a trap. Mrs. Farnham had arranged it all with considerable cleverness. The early token returned to suggest no second visit was expected. The cream excused to ensure Joe would return. The cord run from the handbrake to her bedroom window, giving her the ability to release the brake at the precise moment Joe was most vulnerable. It was diabolical, really, and it had very nearly worked. Without the small inconsistencies, the chalk marks, the broken cream line, the greased window sash, it would have passed as a simple accident. Inspector Slack would have closed the case and Mrs. Farnham would have remained a respectable widow, her reputation intact, but small inconsistencies were Miss Marple's specialty. She had spent a lifetime observing them, understanding what they meant, seeing past the surface to the truth beneath. Now it was time to share that truth with Inspector Slack, whether he liked it or not. Chapter 9. A Sash with Grease. Inspector Slack was not a man who enjoyed being proven wrong. When Miss Marple appeared at the police station that afternoon, he greeted her with the resignation of a man who knows his comfortable conclusions are about to be thoroughly disrupted. Miss Marple, he said with forced patience, What brings you here? Evidence, Inspector. Rather a lot of it, I'm afraid. I wonder if you might spare me a few moments. Slack gestured to a chair with ill grace. Go on, then, but make it quick. I've got real police work to attend to. Miss Marple settled herself and opened her handbag, withdrawing a small notebook. I've been making some observations about Joe Peretta's death. Small details, mostly, but they form a rather disturbing pattern when taken together. I thought we'd established it was an accident. So we did. But accidents, Inspector, generally occur through carelessness or misfortune. This accident was neither. It was arranged with considerable care and deliberation. Slack's expression shifted from annoyance to reluctant interest. Go on. Let us begin with the handbrake. You'll recall the pal tooth was unusually clean and oiled, quite unlike the rest of the mechanism. Someone prepared that brake to slip smoothly and quietly when released. That proves nothing. Could have been regular maintenance, perhaps. But consider the brick that should have been behind the wheel. It was not crushed, but scraped against the wall. It had been moved aside, not run over. And there was a groove in the gatepost with cotton fibers caught in it, suggesting a cord had been drawn tight across that point. Slack frowned but said nothing. Then we have the chalk marks. On the rear tire, 2 marks at different positions, showing the wheel had moved between markings. Why mark a wheel unless you expect it to move? And the broken cream line in the bottle on Mrs. Farnham's step, disturbed by sudden movement, while yesterday's bottle in her kitchen showed a perfect, undisturbed line. Coincidences, possibly. But now consider the timing. Joe Peretta's tally stick and notebook show 2 visits to the Farnham house that morning, one at 5:40, one at 6:10. Why 2 visits? Mavis Dodd tells me Mrs. Farnham asked specifically about returning cream and inquired exactly when Joe would be on Farnham Lane. She was establishing his timing, Inspector. Slack shifted in his chair. Even if that's true, the tokens, Miss Marple interrupted gently. 2 red tokens appeared on the dairy counter at 6:05, but Joe was alive until 6:15 or so. He couldn't have left them. Mrs. Farnham returned them herself early to make it seem the account was settled, and Joe had no reason to return. But he did return at 6:10, for the cream. She'd arranged for him to collect. This is all speculation. Then let us move to physical. Evidence. Mrs. Farnham purchased clothesline and parcel twine the day before Joe died. The clothesline in her linen press is cut short, several feet missing. A scrap was found in her yard bin with a blue foil cap pressed into the knot. And on her bedroom window sash overlooking the yard where Joe died, there is black grease of the type used on mechanical parts. She reached into her handbag and produced the milk token. This was on her bedside table, hidden under a book. It bears the same black grease as the window sash. Someone oiled the brake pawl, Inspector, and handled this token afterward. Slack took the token and examined it. His face had lost its confident certainty. Dr. Haydock said the impact required considerable momentum, Miss Marple continued. But the yard slope is minimal. The float couldn't have built up speed naturally. It needed help, a sudden release of the brake at precisely the right moment. Mrs. Farnham's veranda offers a perfect view of the gate. A cord from the handbrake over the gate post up to her window, one sharp pull, and the brake releases, the float rolls, and Joe Peretta dies. Why would she do it? Because Joe knew too much. He'd seen Dr. Cray visiting at odd hours. He'd noticed bottles standing overnight when Mrs. Farnham claimed to use milk daily. Top cream only forms when bottles sit undisturbed. It proves someone was staying the night. A magistrate's widow cannot afford scandal, Inspector. When Joe hinted at what he knew, perhaps suggested he needed money to settle his debts, Mrs. Farnham chose murder over exposure. Slack was silent for a long moment. Then he stood abruptly. Right. We're going to the Farnham house now. I want to see this window sash for myself." They walked through the village, Slack's constable trailing behind. Dr. Haydock, emerging from his surgery, saw them and fell into step. "What's all this, Slack? You look like a man on a mission. Miss Marple's got some theory about the Peretta death. I'm going to prove her wrong, or right, once and for all." At the Farnham house, Mrs. Farnham received them with cool composure, though Miss Marple noticed her hands gripped each other tightly. "Inspector, Miss Marple, to what do I owe this visit?" "I need to examine your bedroom, Mrs. Farnham, specifically the window overlooking the yard." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I'm investigating a suspicious death." "You can cooperate, or I can obtain a warrant." Mrs. Farnham's face went rigid. "Very well, though I cannot imagine what you expect to find." They climbed the stairs, a small procession of judgment. In the bedroom, Slack went directly to the window and examined the sash. The smear of grease was exactly where Miss Marple had indicated. "This is oil," he said. "Fresh oil." "I know nothing about it," Mrs. Farnham said, but her voice had lost its strength. Slack examined the veranda rail next, finding the cord marks Miss Marple had mentioned. Then he went down to the yard and stood at the gate looking up at the window. "The angle's perfect," he called up. "You could see everything from there?" "Time it exactly." He came back upstairs, his face grim. "Mrs. Farnham, I need you to account for some purchases. Clothesline and twine bought the day before Peretta died. Where are they now?" I don't recall." "I may have used them." "Used them for what?" "The clothesline in your press is cut short." "Where's the missing length?" Mrs. Farnham's composure cracked. "This is absurd. You're accusing me based on household items and some grease on a window." "I'm accusing you," Slack said heavily, "based on a pattern of evidence that suggests you murdered Joe Peretta by releasing his milk float's handbrake from this window, causing it to roll and crush him against the gate." Dr. Haydock examined the window mechanism. "The geometry works," he said quietly. "A cord from here to the gate post down to the float's brake lever. One pull and the brake releases. Physics and leverage would do the rest." Mrs. Farnham sank onto the bed. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "He was going to tell about Hugh, Dr. Cray, about the nights he stayed. Joe saw the bottles, worked it out. He wanted money. He said it would be our secret, but secrets don't stay bought. He'd have come back for more, again and again. So you killed him. I protected my reputation, my son's future, everything I've built since my husband died." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You cannot understand what it is to have everything depend on appearances. One whisper of scandal and it all collapses. I couldn't let that happen. You let a man die instead." Mrs. Farnham said nothing. Her silence was admission enough. Slack nodded to his constable. "Mrs. Lydia Farnham, I'm arresting you for the murder of Joseph Peretta." As they led her out, she paused beside Miss Marple. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" "I suspected," Miss Marple said gently. Small inconsistencies told their story. "But I am sorry, Mrs. Farnham, truly sorry." "Sorry?" Mrs. Farnham's laugh was bitter. "Save your sympathy, Miss Marple. I did what was necessary. I'd do it again." And with that, she walked downstairs with her head high, a magistrate's widow to the last. Chapter 10. Dairy Yard. Brake line and the lady who pulled from above. 2 days after Mrs. Farnham's arrest, Inspector Slack arranged a demonstration in the dairy yard. It was an unusual proceeding, but Slack had learned that sometimes showing how a crime was committed could be as valuable as proving who had done it. The milk float had been brought back, positioned as it had been on that fatal morning. A small group had gathered: Slack and his constable, Dr. Haydock, Edgar Blunt, Mavis Dodd. Dr. Cray, looking pale and shaken, Lady Bantry, and 2 village men recruited to manage the float. Miss Marple stood slightly apart, her knitting bag over her arm, observing everything with those deceptively mild eyes. Slack cleared his throat. Right then, Miss Marple has convinced me that Joe Peretta's death was not an accident. I've asked you all here because you deserve to understand what happened and how it was done. Miss Marple, perhaps you'd explain. Miss Marple stepped forward, her manner gentle but precise. Thank you, Inspector. This was not a crime of passion or sudden violence. It was carefully planned, methodically executed, and very nearly succeeded in appearing accidental. She gestured to the float. The first thing to understand is that this float could not have rolled on its own. The yard slope is too gentle. Mr. Blunt, you mentioned that Joe always used a brick as a chalk. Always, Blunt confirmed gruffly. 20 years, never forgot. Precisely. But on the morning of his death, the brick was found against the wall, not crushed beneath the wheel. It had been moved aside deliberately. She pointed to the brick, which the constable had placed exactly where it was found. You can see the fresh scrape of plaster dust on its edge from being pushed against the wall. She moved to the float's rear wheel. Here we have the chalk marks, 2 marks at different positions, showing the wheel moved between markings. Someone wanted to verify that the float had indeed rolled. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly, checking that the mechanism worked exactly. And here on the gate post, we have a groove worn smooth by something drawn tight across it. Miss Marple ran her finger along the mark. Cotton fibers were caught in the splinter here. The veranda rail above shows a similar polish where a cord rubbed against it under tension. She indicated the handbrake lever. The pal tooth that holds the brake engaged was deliberately cleaned and oiled so it would release smoothly and quietly. The rest of the mechanism was left dirty, but this one crucial part was prepared. But how was it done? Mavis asked, her voice trembling slightly. A length of clothesline purchased the day before was used to create a simple but effective mechanism. One end was looped around this handbrake lever, Miss Marple demonstrated with her hands. The cord then ran up and over the gate post, giving leverage, and continued to the upstairs window of Mrs. Farnham's bedroom. From there, she had a perfect view of the yard and gate. She looked up at the window, still visible from where they stood. Mrs. Farnham arranged for Joe to visit twice that morning. The first visit, at 5:40, allowed her to position everything. The brick was moved aside. The handbrake was checked. The float was precisely placed. Joe delivered 1 pint, as recorded on his tally stick, and left. Why didn't he notice anything wrong? Blunt demanded, because nothing was wrong yet. The float was still secure. The brake was still engaged, though prepared to release. Joe simply made his delivery and moved on. Dr. Cray spoke for the first time, his voice strained. And the second visit was arranged through a request about returning cream. Mrs. Farnham had asked Mavis at the dairy whether Joe could collect cream if it wasn't needed. She'd also inquired about his exact timing. This gave her the information she needed and provided a plausible reason for Joe to return. Miss Marple continued her explanation. Mrs. Farnham returned 2 milk tokens early that morning, at 6:05, placing them on the dairy counter. This was meant to suggest her account was settled, and Joe had no reason to come back. But Joe had already arranged to return at 6:10 for the cream. Clever, Dr. Haydock murmured. Diabolically clever indeed. When Joe returned at 6:10, he approached the gate as usual. From her bedroom window above, Mrs. Farnham watched and waited. At precisely the right moment, when Joe was in position to open the gate, she pulled the cord sharply. The oiled pal released without resistance. The brake disengaged and the float began to roll. She indicated the slight slope. Even a gentle incline provides momentum once movement begins. The float picked up speed, rolled forward, and trapped Joe against the gate post. The force was sufficient to crush his chest. Death was nearly instantaneous. The group stood in somber silence, visualizing the scene. The broken cream line in the bottle on Mrs. Farnham's step showed the sudden violent movement, Miss Marple added, while yesterday's bottle in her kitchen had a perfect, undisturbed line. That discrepancy suggested something had shaken one bottle, but not the other. "What happened to the cord?" the constable asked. After the float rolled, Mrs. Farnham cut the cord at the window with a sharp knife. The section between the float and gatepost fell into the yard. She quickly descended, disposed of the evidence in her yard bin, and then appeared with her maid, feigning shock. The short length of cord was later found in the bin, with a blue foil cap pressed into a knot, exactly as one would expect from handling it near spilled milk. Slack nodded grimly. The grease on her window sash and on a milk token in her bedroom completed the picture. She'd handled the token after oiling the brake pawl. But why? Mavis whispered. Why would Mrs. Farnham do such a terrible thing? Miss Marple's voice was compassionate but firm. Because Joe Peretta knew too much. He'd observed Dr. Cray's frequent early morning visits. He'd noticed bottles standing overnight where Mrs. Farnham claimed to use milk daily. Top cream only forms when bottles sit undisturbed for hours. Joe worked out what it meant, and, unfortunately for him, hinted that his silence could be purchased. Dr. Cray's face flushed red. I never wanted this. Never imagined. No, Miss Marple said gently. I don't suppose you did. But Mrs. Farnham could not afford scandal. Her position, her son's prospects, everything depended on maintaining appearances. When Joe demanded payment, she faced a choice. Pay forever or silence permanently. She chose murder. 37 shillings, Blunt said bitterly. That's what Joe owed me. For that sum he tried blackmail and lost his life. We all stand for a great deal, Miss Marple said quietly. But we do not pull from above to push a man into death. Mrs. Farnham forgot that reputation built on deception is no reputation at all. Slack set the brake and tested the chalk. The float remained stationary. A very tidy accident, he said, echoing his earlier words. Too tidy, Lady Bantry shivered. I shall never look at milk tokens in the same way, Jane. Miss Marple folded her hands on her knitting bag. They are like habits, Dolly. Small circles that tell one exactly what was done and when. In this case, they told the story of a woman who valued appearances more than human life. The group dispersed slowly, each lost in their own thoughts. Dr. Cray departed alone, his career and reputation in ruins. Blunt returned to his dairy, muttering about the difficulty of finding reliable workers. Mavis wiped her eyes and went back to her ledgers. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry walked together through the village, past the cottages where bottles still stood on doorsteps, past the bakery where Mr. Puckle was already preparing tomorrow's bread. It's all so sad, Dolly, she said. Everyone loses, Joe, Mrs. Farnham, Dr. Cray, even that poor boy at art school who will have to live with his mother's shame. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Murder is always sad, Dolly. It destroys far more than just the victim, but justice must be served regardless of how sad the circumstances. They reached Miss Marple's gate. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, and somewhere a robin sang its evening song. Will you testify at the trial? Dolly asked. If required, yes, though I suspect Mrs. Farnham will plead guilty. She's a proud woman, but not a foolish one. The evidence is overwhelming. Thanks to you, Miss Marple smiled slightly. Thanks to observation, Dolly, and to understanding that people, when pressed, will act according to their nature. Mrs. Farnham valued respectability above all else. When that was threatened, she acted to preserve it. The method was clever, but the motive was as ancient as time itself. Fear of exposure. They said their goodbyes, and Miss Marple went inside to a quiet sitting room. She took up her knitting and settled into her chair by the window. Outside, the village continued its eternal rhythm. Milk would be delivered tomorrow. Morning, bottles would appear on doorsteps, and life would go on. But St. Mary, Mead would not forget the winter morning when a milkman died for knowing too much, or the lady who pulled a cord from above and sent a good man to his death. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in the fading light, marking time as they always had, as they always would. Justice had been served. Truth had emerged, and in the end, that was all one could ask.